everyone. Welcome to tonight's talk. I'm Nikki from the Kellogg Hubbard Library, and we're pleased to be partnering with the League of Women Voters for this series. Before I get started, I'd like to let everyone know that this meeting is being recorded. Please remain muted throughout the presentation to ensure the best experience for all participants. If you have questions, please type them into the chat, and our moderator and speaker will address them. Now I'll hand it over to Kate from the League of Women Voters.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us for the second program of this, our 9th series in partnership with the Kellogg Hubbard Library. Tonight we'll be discussing the Supreme Court case known as Grants Pass, Oregon versus Johnson, in which the Supreme Court upheld a local ordinance allowing arrest of people, homeless people, camping on public property. Our moderator tonight is Liz Scharf, chair of the Middlesex Select Board, and she's also director of Community Economic Development and Food Security at Capstone Community Action, which offers programs and services to support and strengthen the lives of Vermonters who live with low incomes, many of who are unhoused and face housing insecurity. Liz will introduce our speakers tonight.
Thank you, Kate. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for that introduction. Tonight, we are privileged to have two guests here to speak about this ruling. Our first guest is Falco Schilling. He joined the ACLU of Vermont as its first advocacy director in July of 2019. He has been working to promote positive social change in Vermont since 2009. He's a native of Vermont and received his law degree from Vermont Law School after attending Skidmore College. Prior to joining the ACLU, Falco spent 5 years leading winning legislative and grassroots campaigns at VPIRG. Falco then joined the team at Action Circles, where he worked with clients to develop campaign plans, create effective messaging, provide advocacy trainings, and lobby on their behalf. Since joining the ACLU of Vermont, Falco has worked with legislative leaders and allies to achieve a number of significant victories, including passing one of the nation's strongest police use of force laws, significant reductions to the number of people incarcerated in Vermont's prisons, and passage of Vermont's Reproductive Liberty Amendment, enshrining the right to access reproductive health care in Vermont's Constitution. We also have Frank Kanak, who became the executive director of the Housing and Homelessness Alliance of Vermont in December of 2023, so just a year ago. So for the past 20 years, Frank has engaged in human rights advocacy at multiple levels, from the United Nations human rights system to municipal government. More recently, Frank served in a number of leadership positions, including in ACLU affiliates in several states. Frank has led the creation of multiple advocacy campaigns, including campaigns to build public safety systems that prioritize investments in people and communities rather than arrests and incarceration, rein in court systems funded off the backs of the poor, ensure equal access to the courts, and create a public health-centered approach to drug policy. Frank regularly testifies on human rights issues before legislative and administrative bodies and is the author or co-author of numerous policy and documentation reports. And Frank and his wife grew up in southern Vermont and are excited to be back home to raise their kids in the Green Mountains. So Falco and Frank, welcome to tonight's conversation hosted by Kellogg Hubbard Library and the Vermont League of Women Voters. So Falco, I'll start with you. Kate briefly touched on this, but the United States Supreme Court this past June released its 6-3 majority opinion in the Grants Pass, Oregon versus Johnson case, a decision that involved interpreting the Eighth Amendment, which gives municipalities greater leeway in regulating unhoused encampments. Could you take us through this case and the majority's interpretation of the Eighth Amendment on a high level, so that in sort of layperson's terms, please?
I will do my best. And thank you so much for that introduction. It's really great to be with you all here tonight. As Liz said, I'm Falco Schilling, and I'm the Advocacy Director at the ACLU of Vermont. In practical terms, what that means is, though I'm an attorney, I don't go to court. I spend most of my time up in the legislature working with the administration and working on policy issues. So I want to give some credit to the attorneys who are much more on the litigation side of things in my office, who are helping me prepare for this evening and providing me case notes and some thoughts to share with you all this evening. And I'm happy to dive in. You'll notice I'm be reading from some of my notes, but be excited to answer your questions as we move forward. So to start off, Grants Pass was the first time that the Supreme Court directly addressed whether a so-called camping ban could violate the Eighth Amendment's cruel and unusual punishment clause. In order to understand Grants Pass, though, it's important to understand a little bit more about the court's underlying Eighth Amendment jurisprudence. As the Supreme Court articulated in 1977 in Ingram versus Wright, the Eighth Amendment does three things. First, it limits the kinds of punishment that can be imposed on those convicted of crimes. Second, it forbids punishment that is grossly disproportionate to the severity of the crime. And third, and this is the least common and most controversial, it imposed substantive limits on what can be made criminal and punished as such. And the authority for this third category, imposing limits on what can be made criminal, originates almost entirely from a 1962 case called Robinson v. California. In Robinson, the Supreme Court considered whether a state may convict an individual for violating a statute, making it a criminal offense to be addicted to the use of narcotics. The court basically said no, without saying much more. It discussed alcoholism as a disease, including what may be involuntary, and simply said that a law which made criminal offenses of such a disease would doubtless be universally thought to be an infliction of cruel and unusual punishment in violation of the 8th and 14th Amendment, but it didn't really exactly spell out how. And so 6 years later, the court heard another case, and this case is Powell v. Texas. Powell, in this case, was charged with violating a Texas statute making a crime to get drunk or to be found in a state of intoxication in a public place. The justices in that case interpreted Robinson to prohibit only the criminalization of pure status, but not to limit the criminalization of conduct. So to dive into that a little bit more, because Powell was convicted not for his status as a chronic alcoholic, but rather for his acts of becoming intoxicated and appearing so in public, the court in Powell concluded that the clause was interpreted, the clause as interpreted by Robinson did not protect him in this instance. And so as we look at this and think about the situation in front of us, it's plain to see the logic of these cases obviously implicates camping bans, especially applied to folks who are experiencing homelessness. And that's especially true where there's nowhere else to go, because camping bans essentially criminalize unavoidable, life-sustaining, and fundamentally human acts. And so moving forward, the line of cases connecting Robinson and Powell to the experience of homelessness really begins in 2006. In a case called Jones versus Los Angeles, the Ninth Circuit confronted challenges to camping bans where the plaintiffs looked to Robinson and Powell and concluded that criminalizing sleeping outside when there is nowhere else to go violates the Eighth Amendment. The court concluded that the Robinson and Powell decisions read together compelled the court to conclude that enforcing camping bans at all times and all places against homeless individuals who are just sitting, lying, or sleeping because they cannot obtain shelter violates the cruel and unusual punishment clause. But in 2019, the Ninth Circuit narrowed that precedent and ruled in Martin v. Boise that enforcing public camping ordinances against unhoused individuals was impermissible whenever the number of homeless individuals in a jurisdiction exceeds the number of practically available shelter beds. And so we have to remember, these are circuit court decisions, not Supreme Court decisions. And after that, the Supreme Court decided to take up these cases a few years later. And so, as you know, a lot can change in 5 years, including the composition of the Supreme Court. When these cases were originally passed, Justice Ginsburg was still in the court, and the court, even though it was lopsided at the time, was significantly more balanced than it is today. And so, after the recomposition of the court, when this issue resurfaced again, the court decided to take it up. The case that's made its way to the Supreme Court that we're talking about tonight originated because Grants Pass, Oregon, enacted ordinances which prohibited camping on public property and parking overnight in the city's park. And so the ordinance in question, under this ordinance, a first violation would be a civil fine of $295, which then increased to $450 if not paid. And very critically, after 2 citations, police could issue an order banning an individual from a city property. And anyone who violated that order can be evicted of criminal trespass, which carries penalties of up to 30 days in jail and a $2,500 fine. The Ninth Circuit, which ruled on the cases I discussed previously, invalidated the ban as violating the Eighth Amendment, relying on the Martin cases that we previously discussed. And then when the case made it to the Supreme Court, that decision was reversed in a 6-3 decision. Justice Gorsuch wrote for the court saying, the Eighth Amendment cruel and unusual punishments clause has been considered, and properly so, to be directed at the method or kind of punishment a government can impose for the violation of criminal statutes. There are multiple constitutional provisions that place limits on what the government may criminalize and how the government can enforce the laws. The Eighth Amendment, Gorsuch conclude, only focuses on what happens next. And so to back that out just a little bit, the primary holding was that Gorsuch found that the Eighth Amendment a poor foundation for prohibiting the types of ordinances that we're talking about in the Grants Pass case. And the Eighth Amendment focuses on the method or kind of punishment a government may impose after a criminal conviction, not the question of whether a government may criminalize behavior in the first place. So going back to what I said earlier, looking at those three potential ways that the Eighth Amendment can restrict government conduct, this limited in some ways the opportunity for the Eighth Amendment to be used as a tool to stop the government from imposing certain criminal penalties. The court also addressed Robinson, essentially narrowing it to the facts of that case in particular. They conclude that even under Robinson, the ordinances at issue were fine, as they do not criminalize the status of homelessness, but rather the action of camping on public property. So to quote from the decision, Gorsuch said, it makes no difference whether the charged defendant is homeless, a backpacker on vacation passing through town, or a student who abandons his dorm to camp out and protest on the lawn of a municipal building. In essence saying, this statute is not in fact criminalizing homelessness, it's just criminalizing the act of sleeping outside, which I think in some ways takes a logical leap because it does not address the fact that there are certain individuals for whom that is not a choice. So then the Justices Sotomayor, Kagan, and Brown-Jackson dissented. And some of the key parts of that dissent came from Sotomayor, who said the only question before the Supreme Court in this case is whether the Constitution permits punishing homeless people with no access to shelter for sleeping in public with as little as a blanket to keep warm. The answer to the question in that opinion is no, the Constitution does not permit that. Her main contention was that the majority misunderstood Robinson, and the ordinances of this case do in fact criminalize being homeless. Moreover, she suggested the majority is concerned that upholding the lower court's ruling because it created too many difficult questions, such as whether someone was involuntarily homeless, were really unfounded. She wrote that just because the majority can't list difficult questions that require answers does not absolve federal judges of the responsibility to interpret and enforce the substantive bounds of the Constitution. She concluded that she remained hopeful that someday in the near future, this court will play its role in safeguarding constitutional liberties for the most vulnerable among us. But in her view, the court today abdicated that role. So all of this really begs the question, how big of a deal is Grants Pass in terms of responding to homelessness? And I want to be clear that I disagree with this decision and think it's disappointing in a number of ways, but the actual impact may in fact be a little bit more limited. The central question in this case was whether the Eighth Amendment's ban on cruel and unusual punishment by itself prohibited enforcement of the city's anti-camping ordinance. And in saying no, the court rejected one really specific constitutional provision as posing a barrier to enforcing certain camping bans. And it essentially removed one tool from the toolbox, but it didn't bless all camping bans in all forms everywhere, as some of the headlines you might have seen characterized it. And due in part to this broad characterization of the grants past decision, our attorneys at the ACLU this fall drafted a letter to municipalities aiming to clarify in part what that decision did and didn't do. So grants past, in other words, rejected some specific constitutional provisions as posing particular barrier to enforcing certain camping bans. The opinion in no way authorized additional penalties, measures, or policies against unsheltered Vermonters, and it did not address or alter the myriad additional protections that unsheltered residents continue to possess beyond the Eighth Amendment. And so some of the rights that still exist for folks and that municipalities and governments everywhere need to be aware of and thinking about as they're looking at crafting any sort of restriction, such as camping bans or other restrictions that might impact unhoused populations, are property and privacy rights. All Vermonters, including unhoused Vermonters, and those living in encampments have a right to privacy and the right to be free from having their property unreasonably seized and confiscated. All Vermonters have due process rights, and under both the Vermont and federal constitutions, and municipalities must adhere to robust due process for any governmental action that affects the legal interest of any community member, including community members that are unhoused. And it also includes free speech rights. The Supreme Court has held repeatedly and emphatically that asking for money or other kinds of assistance is protected free speech. The Constitution therefore prohibits municipalities from limiting free speech by punishing panhandling and things like that. And then finally, anti-discrimination provisions also protect these populations. Vermonters enjoy not only strong federal restrictions against discrimination, but also strong state-specific protections that prevent municipalities from targeting those who are unsheltered. These protections come from places like Article 7 of the Vermont Constitution, the Commons Benefits Clause, that embraces principles of equal protection and forbids municipalities from singling out or denying in any part of the community, including unhoused community members, the same rights and protections, of course, others. And then finally, the Vermont Fair Housing and Public Accommodations Act also provides additional protections, often applicable to unsheltered people, many of whom may have disabilities. So wrapping that up, and before I hand the microphone over to Frank, I wanted to say that in conclusion, just because one part of the federal Constitution fails to protect unhoused folks doesn't mean that nothing can protect these folks. Fundamentally, questions around criminalization generally belong to the states. And so we have opportunities to create better protections for people who are unhoused, either through enactments of new statutes or through litigation based on existing case law or state constitutions. And now I am going to pass it over to Frank, who can speak more to some of the impact on the ground, where we can go from here, and his experience of this issue.
Cool. Thanks, Falco. And hi, everyone. First, thanks to the Kellogg Hubbard Library and to the League for inviting us to this great event. So I'm happy to talk about kind of the impact in Vermont around this, the state of homelessness in Vermont, and also some of the policy arguments for why, even if what as Falco mentioned, the case has limits in terms of what municipalities can and can't do going forward, but even if this decision had opened up the floodgates and said, municipalities, yes, you have legal capacity, there's no prohibition against you passing these ordinances. There are very strong public policy arguments for why that would be, the absolute worst thing that a municipality could do. So maybe I'll start there. I think from a couple of different angles, I think it would be troubling if we were to see an uptick of municipalities thinking about going the route of grants passed and passing ordinances that criminalize unhoused people who are simply just trying to find a place to sleep and have no other option. And so I think, it's obviously inhumane on its face, as Falco mentioned. It places people in an impossible choice of either staying awake or facing criminal sanction. Even kind of setting aside the inhumanity of these types of laws and ordinances, it's also extremely counterproductive. And so it's counterproductive in a couple of ways. I think if the goal of a public safety system is to ensure community safety, then it's important that we enact ordinances and laws and penalties that are actually based in evidence and not just rhetoric in terms of how we approach the issues. And so from an evidence-based perspective, when you're passing ordinances like this and criminalizing people for the mere act of sleeping when they have no choice, what you're doing in reality is you're placing hurdles in front of their ability to get housing. You're placing hurdles in front of their ability to get employment. Two of the key things that we need to ensure that we can move people out of homelessness and into permanent housing. And so what I mean by that is, I think we all know by now, criminal records, when folks have criminal records, which would occur in these cases, it makes it less likely that an employer would be interested in hiring that person. There's been significant research on this. There's also a less likelihood that, as we all know in Vermont, it's a very tight rental market. And when someone checks the box that they have a past criminal history, it also makes it less likely that a landlord with an opening would rent to that person. And so, right there, you're talking about two things that are going to make it more difficult to move people out of homelessness and into permanent housing. It also disrupts, when these ordinances are passed, the way they enforce it is they move in, they do encampment sweeps, they take people's belongings with that. And so as Falco mentioned, there's issues around Fourth Amendment search and seizure that may arise in those instances, but also from a practical perspective, it's deeply problematic and counterproductive, because what that means in reality is that folks, may have their identification taken in that sweep, and there's robust evidence to show that that in fact does happen. And so what that means in reality, then again, it makes it more difficult, because as we all know, when you don't have identification, to be able to access benefits, to be able to access employment, to be able to access housing, all those things become more difficult when you don't have identification. Another thing it does is, I think one of the things, and I can talk about this a little bit more detail down the road, but we have an amazing shelter and service provider network in Vermont who are perpetually under-resourced and overworked. But what they're doing day in and day out across Vermont communities is going out, meeting with unhoused people, building trust, connecting them with the resources that are available. And when these sweeps occur, what that does in reality, again, is disrupts that connection. It makes it then more difficult. People will then, go and maybe camp deeper into the woods, maybe be harder to find. And so what that does, it makes it more difficult for our homelessness prevention system to function the way it's designed to function. And so I think for all those reasons, even if it were an open legal or not an open legal question, I think it would be a bad idea for municipalities to go down that route. But just to give a little context of what we're looking at in Vermont right now in terms of homelessness. So every year, the way kind of states across the country count, understand what the homelessness situation is in their state, is done through what's called the point in time count, which is a standard way across the country that all jurisdictions count the number of unsheltered people on a specific given night each year, so that we can have as best as possible an apples to apples understanding of what homelessness looks like across the country. And so according to the most recent point in time count in Vermont, we had around 3,500 unsheltered people on any given night in Vermont. And we know through other data sets that represents a huge undercount. And to give that some perspective in terms of how we measure up against other states across the country, Vermont has the second highest per capita rate of unhoused people in the entire country. And so we have a serious problem on our hands in terms of the state's failure to adequately respond to the crisis at hand. And so the causes of this crisis are many, but I think the two core causes of this crisis are the increasing kind of gap between wages and cost of living, kind of costs of housing, and also the rising cost in housing. So it's really about a lack of access to affordable housing in Vermont, which is really the crux of the cause of our unhoused crisis. And so because we have this huge unhoused crisis, one would think that we would really be intentionally investing in a homelessness response system. And it's something that we have really failed to adequately do to the level that we need to do in Vermont. And so to give you some context for that, as I mentioned, we have, upwards of at least 3,500 people unsheltered on any given night in Vermont. And we have a statewide complete shelter capacity of 580 beds. And so simple math shows that we have a huge gap between the available shelter in Vermont and the number of people who need access to shelter. And so because of that, the state created what's called the General Assistance Emergency Housing Program. And so commonly, you all probably heard about this as the hotel motel program. And so what that was done in effect was to kind of create this backup plan because we knew we didn't have enough shelter to address the moment. And so we would create additional capacity utilizing hotels and motels across Vermont. Unfortunately, over the last couple of years, we've seen the legislature and the administration just chip away at that to a point now where we have, a small fraction of the people who used to be eligible for the program able to access the program. And so we have a huge gap in terms of the number of people who need access to shelter versus the number of people who are able to access shelter. And so what that does is creates huge opportunities for municipalities to kind of take this, rhetoric-based approach to this, which is we're just going to criminalize unsheltered people and arrest our way out of homelessness, which is what we tried to do with the drug war, what we tried to do with many, many different things. And it's the reason we are the leader worldwide in incarceration in the United States. And so kind of looking at that from that angle, I think is really important. But I also think, particularly in a state like Vermont, that has really tried to reckon with the kind of racist history of this country and racist policy, I also think it's really important to look at this from a racial justice lens and the kind of disproportionate impact that, any ordinances that would criminalize unsheltered people would have on Black Vermonters. And so why I'm saying that is because just like in the criminal legal system where you see staggering disparities between the ratio of Black people versus white people arrested, when we're looking at unhoused data in Vermont, we know that Black Vermonters are more than 5 times more likely than white Vermonters to be unhoused. And so any ordinance that would be lifted up at a local level that would criminalize unsheltered people would necessarily have a disparate impact on Black Vermonters because they are just so overrepresented in our unhoused populations in Vermont for a whole host of reasons, going back to kind of, the legacy of slavery, not in Vermont, but kind of how it's impacted across the country, Jim Crow laws, convict leasing laws, and then modern racist policy, redlining, the war on drugs, et cetera, that has kind of created a massive racial wealth divide in this country that manifests in multiple ways, including, disproportionate number of Black people lacking access to shelter in Vermont. So that's kind of a quick overview of the situation. And I don't know if
Frank, could you explain to the audience when you're talking about these 3,500 unsheltered people, do you literally mean people living like outside, or does that include people who may be living with relatives but don't have an apartment? Could you define sort of unhoused versus unsheltered and what we mean by that?
Yeah, definitely. So unhoused could mean anyone who is included in our shelter system right now. Unsheltered would be the folks who are not, currently sheltered in any type of emergency or temporary shelter capacity. According to HUD, people who are couch surfing are considered unhoused. And I think, we often hear, why aren't people just going and finding a place, living with friends, things like that. So not only does it fit the definition of unhoused under HUD regulations, but also what that does is then it makes it more likely that we're going to have additional people unhoused, because that means that people are probably breaking their lease agreements and having additional people in their homes at that time, which kind of, can magnify the crisis going forward.
Right. And so you also talked a little bit, it sounds to me like you feel like criminalizing people and having ordinances and enforcing laws that prohibit people from camping publicly is not the right approach. So what specific policies can municipalities adopt to address homelessness effectively and constitutionally and, just empathetically, right? Because I know it seems like a lot of cities, grapple with this problem, lack of funding, lack of resources. What do you suggest that we do instead, I guess?
Definitely. I think, well, we know from robust research that the solution to homelessness is housing. And so there are lots of things that localities can do in terms of rethinking their regulations, zoning laws, et cetera, to make it easier to build housing, to build units in their jurisdictions. We see lots of NIMBYism. We have lots of abilities for even one or two people at a local level to kind of muck up, a build project for affordable housing or a shelter project. We have appeals processes that can be dragged out for years on end that can cost, hundreds, if not millions of dollars in additional costs to developers. So I think that's one concrete thing that localities can do is really kind of take a hard look at their regulatory system and cut anything that is making it more difficult to build the solution, which is affordable housing for Vermonters. It's not just the right thing to do from a human perspective, but if you look at, why it's harder to recruit doctors and nurses in Vermont, we don't have enough housing. If you look at why, businesses are struggling it's because we don't have enough housing. And so this is an issue that's not just kind of a moral issue, but it's also an economic imperative in Vermont. I think other things we can do at the local level is, we need to kind of rethink our approach to harm reduction and really kind of embrace harm reduction principles and policies at the local level. So, for example, last year, the Vermont legislature passed legislation enabling overdose prevention centers to be set up in Vermont. And so there's one pilot project that's happening in Burlington, but just because that's happening in Burlington doesn't mean other municipalities couldn't also do the same thing. Overdose prevention centers have decades and decades of research showing that they are effective models for, saving lives, getting people into treatment. There's no corresponding crime that coincides with the construction of an OPC in a community. And so it's kind of really building harm reduction policies out and kind of moving away from this kind of criminal legal response to everything that we're mad at and embracing evidence-based practices in response. Also, talking to their state delegation and urging their state delegation to appropriate the necessary funds for, again, the solution, which is permanent affordable housing. We need to spend upwards of $1 billion over the next 10 years on affordable housing to solve this crisis. And so there's no reason why we can't do that. We have revenue. There was legislation last year that would also have created a new wealth tax in Vermont to ensure that folks make, the top 1% pay their fair share. That would have raised upwards of $75 million a year that could have been put into affordable housing. So, urging at the local level your state delegation to support these laws and these bills at the state level, I think is really, really important and concrete things that localities can do. I'm not sure if you have other thoughts.
Yeah, I think you covered that quite well. But I just wanted to talk a little bit to some of the cost issue in terms of the cost of a criminal legal response and how that is actually in many ways much less affordable in our communities. To incarcerate someone in Vermont costs around $261 a night and approximately $90,000 a year for every single person that we are incarcerating in a state prison. And when you look at how those funds could be used in other areas, it costs significantly less to fund at the base level things like motel rooms for folks who need shelter, and then also with money to spare to be putting into programs and other facilities such as shelters, providing supports and services for folks who might be unsheltered and unhoused. And so I think often we become so accustomed to looking towards criminalization as the tool we're most often used to using, but we need to think more creatively because even from just the dollars and cents perspective, it's one of the most unaffordable and ineffective ways to address some of the root causes that lead to folks being unsheltered and unhoused, and it creates a really harmful cycle that then makes it harder for someone to maintain permanent housing going forward and maintain those connections in their community. So before we think about using criminalization as a response, we need to think about all the downstream impacts. But then, this is one of those things that, and I talk to people of different political persuasions. Some folks are persuaded by some things, and some folks are just persuaded by the dollars and cents. And we just look at how much it costs to put someone into a prison cell. It's simply unaffordable, and one of the worst ways we can be using our state resources to try and address the problems we face as communities.
This makes me think about, like, one of our programs at Capstone that we have is part of the ERAP program, which provides homeless, which provides assistance to help people stay housed. So I think one of the, a lot of folks who face barriers to being housed have, like you've mentioned, they may have substance use disorders, they may have criminal backgrounds, they may have, they may have disabilities, and it makes it harder for them to stay housed. And so even if we had, I mean, right now we know we don't have enough housing, right? But even if we had enough housing, there still would be, I think, a need for helping support people to not just get housing, but stay housed. Do you see that as a, and I don't know who would like to address this, maybe Frank, do you see this as a need going forward, that we provide these kinds of services?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, as you mentioned, just because someone has a roof over their head doesn't mean they can keep that roof over their head if they have unmet medical needs or transportation needs or whatever those might be. So supportive services are an absolute key requirement of whatever, where we're moving. So I think you had mentioned the ERAP funds, which is something we're really concerned about because those are drying up. Those are those, federal dollars that'll be drying up at the end of June, I believe. And so at the state level right now, we have the HOP program, which provides a lot of funding for a lot of those homelessness prevention services. And we're going to be advocating not only to maintain the HOP funding, but also for the state to make up for those lost ERAP dollars. Because we know that, we already have a homelessness crisis in Vermont. We cannot backslide and make it worse. And so we need to ensure that we're investing the dollars into the prevention side to kind of keep people sheltered or keep people housed in permanent housing, and not magnify the crisis. But absolutely, that's a key part of any long-term solution, is having funding for those.
Great. I'll remind the audience that if you have a question for our speakers, you can put that in the group chat and I will address those questions. Another question I have is around sort of the municipal responsibility of, if they're not going to be necessarily enforcing, is there sort of a responsibility that municipalities have to provide shelters for folks? And I mean, is that even a good idea, right? Like to have more shelters while we're waiting for this housing, and what responsibilities do the municipalities have? Because in the end, it's really the taxpayers who have to support that kind of program if there aren't the federal dollars to support that. Who would like to comment on that?
Want me to take that, Walker, or do you want to? Or
Go for it.
Yeah, so I think, I guess, a couple layer response to that question. I think at a kind of more kind of global rhetorical level, I think, the basic role of government is to ensure the basic safety of its residents. And so I think one of the things we've lost over the years is what that does and should mean. I think we've gotten to a place in our society where we think public safety, we think police, we think incarceration, rather than the things that actually make community members safer, like a roof over their head, like, public transportation, like quality public education, food security, clean environment, et cetera. And I think because of that, we've like allowed the budgeting process, which is supposed to be like this document that outlines the kind of moral position of our community in terms of where funding goes, and have had those kind of grossly, hijacked to kind of go into programs and policies that actually make our communities less safe. And so I think it's really important at that level to kind of rethink what public safety does mean and should mean in our communities, and ensure that, at the municipal level, at the state level, at the federal level, that our budgets reflect the needs of actual community members, and not just that we're just going to throw money away into prisons and police like we've done for so long. And so, for example, in Vermont right now, I think it's like nearly $200 million a year that we're spending on prisons. For the vast, vast majority of people who are incarcerated, that is the absolute worst thing we could be doing. It's increasing the likelihood that they will recidivate when they get out. It's not actually making communities safer. And if we invested in kind of front end responses, we'd have much safer communities going forward. I think practically speaking, what municipalities can be doing, I think the goal is not to build out a shelter system that meets the current need, because the more money we're putting into the shelter system means less money going into permanent affordable housing, which is the solution. And so I think, we need to invest in our shelter system and increase the number of beds that are available. But what we have in Vermont, we have this great backstop program that we really just need to invest the money we need to invest in, which is the hotel motel program. And so we should be maximizing our dollars into the solution, permanent affordable housing. We should be maximizing the capacity of hotels and motels in Vermont to keep people sheltered at a rate that is, as Falco mentioned, much less than the cost of incarceration. And investing in the services and supports that kind of keep people housed going forward. And I think in terms of looking at it from the kind of fiscal impact, Falco mentioned this a little earlier in terms of the cost relative to like incarceration versus providing a hotel, but also, when, we hear this debate all the time at the state level that we just can't afford this. And it's like, we can't afford the hotel motel program, pretending that if the state doesn't invest those dollars, that those costs just go away. They don't. They just get brought to the municipality and they get magnified. And so, they get magnified in the sense that we're dealing with police and first responders at a rate that is unhelpful to communities. Also, emergency rooms become the primary caregivers for people when they don't have access to other basic needs, which are astronomically higher than the cost of sheltering someone, for example. And so I think it's really important to kind of correct the record that, municipalities are going to pay for this one way or the other. And it's, do they want to pay for this in an efficient way, in an effective way, or do they want to pay for it in a wildly inefficient, wildly ineffective way? And so I think it's really important that we kind of make that clear, kind of that distinction to folks, that this is not like, you're either going to pay or not pay. It's just kind of the level that we're going to pay and the harm that's going to be created if we don't do it the right way.
Falco, I'm going to bring this up, this sort of a devil's advocate question. During the pandemic, we had the hotel motel program, and I know, I think it was Digger just did an article, the AmeriCorps person there, Carly Berlin, I think her name is, did an article about the myth around people coming from out of state to use our hotel system because we were offering free hotel rooms, and anecdotally talking with some of our housing counselors here at Capstone, they felt like they were seeing people that were coming over the border from Massachusetts, New York, New Hampshire. And I'm wondering if you could comment on that, like, is that a myth? Did our homeless population at that point in time, where we were the second highest state with a homeless population next to California, was that a result of the social services, the broad social services that we offered, or was it something else?
Yeah, that piece was, I thought, really well done and really helpful in terms of digging into some of those myths. So I think from my perspective, it is a myth, especially when you look at the other places around the country. where this myth also takes hold. There was some great research in there looking at places like Seattle and Minneapolis and other places where that is also the narrative there, that, oh, this is what's driving the increase in the population, our housing population, our homeless population, is the fact that we have more robust services. When in fact, you look at it, it's the low availability of housing is the one common thread in all of those municipalities. But I also just say from my personal experience in the state house, that is a myth that's perpetuated in so many different areas when it comes to discussing government supports and services. And I think it's also a pretty problematic one. It's the idea that, and I think, as a Vermonter, something that I have felt was deeply ingrained in me and I've seen in my communities is this ethos that we care for each other. And you see this come up as we have responses to floods and other natural disasters. It's this idea that, we all will get together, we'll care for each other. We might not be the most chatty and outgoing folks all the time, but if your neighbor needs something, you're going to be there to help. In some ways, I find that narrative is a way to other folks within our communities to say they're not really part of our community, they're someone else, they're from away. We don't have a responsibility to these folks. And in many ways, so many of us have come from away in one time or another, and that is a justification that I don't think speaks to the situation and the obligations we have to each other as a community. But I'm sure that there were some folks who found themselves in Vermont and who might not have been here at the start of the pandemic and had to take advantage of those programs. But I don't think that I have not seen any evidence that that was a major driver, and that's what's driving up the rates of homelessness we're seeing. Is the state in the country with the second highest rate of homelessness. I think one of the things that's very clear is it's a lack of housing, and that is, as I said before, the through line that you see in the places with the highest rates of homelessness. It's not that there are magical programs that support people at outlandish levels, and I think you'll talk to folks who have had to take advantage of plenty of the government programs here in Vermont. Not often the type of thing that someone would get up and move to try and take advantage of. The barriers to access are often very difficult, as we've seen with the hotel motel program, especially as we move forward. Just the ability to access those benefits is extremely daunting. And I've talked to a number of folks who've experienced poverty, and they say being poor is a full-time job, and because of all the things you have to do to try and access any sort of support you might need, the number of calculations you have to make as you're living your daily lives. So in short, I think it's a myth that is often used to help us feel better about not going that extra mile or trying to extend that level of support that we would to our friend or neighbor just because we might not know them. But it can be problematic and can take hold in a number of policy areas outside of the housing context as well.
Great, thank you. We do have a question from Jean Hopkins, and this relates to her question is, could Champlain Housing Trust build supportive, affordable condo associations of small apartments? And the down streets and the Champlain Housing Trusts of the state, where do they get their money, and how quickly can they build affordable housing, or what are their barriers to even building affordable housing?
In terms of where they get their money, I don't know the full universe where it comes from, but I know they do significant private philanthropy work. They get state dollars coming to them, and the money that comes to them, it takes years to get, from when they get the project, authorized and funded to when the apartments are available for folks to be able to move into. So it's kind of an extremely long, complicated process. And I think it's one of the reasons that we are advocating for sustained multi-year investments to really kind of maximize the capacity of our affordable housing development community here in Vermont. We have amazing housing trusts with CHT, with Downstreet, Twin Pines, and others. And so I think it's really important that the state resource them to the level that they can build, which is quite significant.
Great. And then Nick asks, so a lot of these housing trusts, where people have subsidized housing, they're limited to who can stay in their apartment. And so he says he sees, he's wondering if they could be asked to relax some of their lease agreements because of this housing crisis, because he sees a number of folks who are sheltering with their friends and family members, but then they have to leave after 2 weeks. Maybe Falco, you have some thoughts on that.
I mean, yeah, I think that's a thing that could be done both through agreements with the housing trusts in an a more informal way, but also there are opportunities within state statute to govern what is required in a lease agreement and other things along those lines. So I think short answer is yes, and it's something that folks could look at. But I will say that in our work at the State House last year, one of the things we were confronting and that was concerning was due to stories folks had heard around really negative impacts from the opioid epidemic and other situations, a real push to make it easier to evict people. And because there's concerns about people who be staying for longer, or what might be happening with people who are not on the lease, and even making it easier to evict people because of the activities of someone who is not officially on the lease. And I really appreciate the advocacy of folks like Vermont Legal Aid, who came in and helped correct some of the myths and also share some of the realities on the ground around situations like that. A lot of those policies did not end up moving forward. But it was so short answer is yes, but it's a thing that I'm also concerned about is a push to make it even easier to move forward with evictions because of some concerns that folks have seen in their communities.
Okay, and Tucker has this comment and question. They say, there are, of course, a lot of social concerns that can drive or motivate the criminalization of homelessness, public camping, etc., such as concerns around sanitation, example, litter. Are there programs that can be implemented, particularly easily or cheaply, at the state or municipal level to make public camping, particularly in the context of homelessness, more palatable to local communities while we work to rehouse people? So is there something we can do in the interim while we're waiting for this housing? Frank?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I'm answering the question correctly or not, but I do think there are things that municipalities can do kind of in this kind of interim phase to make life a little bit better for folks who don't have access to shelter in terms of like porta potties, access to water, things like that, that we've seen some municipalities try and do. But again, I think it's really important that we have the ability in Vermont to solve this crisis and to provide shelter, and we just lack the political will to do that. And so I think it's really important that we also kind of keep our foot on the pedal on, not letting folks back away from the fact that we can solve this crisis if we want to.
Yeah, I heard, I think I read, I'm forgetting his name, who wrote, Matthew Desmond, I think. He was like, there's enough money to end poverty. It's just allocating the resources in the way to do it. And there's money out there. It's just not being spent in the way that it would need to be to end that kind of crisis. Victoria has a comment. She's optimistically says you can have both and. Certainly some unhoused people and some who are housed also need various kinds of support to maintain housing, but access to adequate affordable housing would serve many, not all of the people who are currently unhoused because they simply can't afford the current inflated cost of housing, but otherwise their lives are working okay. So that addresses just the cost itself of housing, right? And we could provide supportive housing for those whose needs are more extensive and more complex. So I actually have a question regarding the housing crisis in Vermont. Because Vermont is a tourist destination, and with the evolution of Airbnbs, um, I think part of what's happening with our housing crisis is that we're living longer, right? And older people can't afford to leave their homes because they can't afford to buy something smaller, and there's nothing to buy, so they're not leaving. And if they do pass away, their heirs will often just use it as an Airbnb or turn it into um something that doesn't become housing that's available to the next generation of homeowners or renters. I'm wondering if there's truth to that, or is that just my sort of assumption that it's not, because our population hasn't gone up exponentially, right? So why is there not enough housing? Like, what happened to the housing? Frank?
I think that's definitely part of the issue. I think, looking at like VHFA's housing needs assessment, we need to build, 25 to 30,000 new units over the next 5 years to meet the demand. So I do think that there is a need to construct new units. Also, there's lots of homes in Vermont that are abandoned or kind of in a state where people can't live there. And so we have programs in place to enable people to rehabilitate those, to get state funds to rehabilitate those, and have those funds forgiven if they use those, if they agree to um, to um, 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 rent those then out to people who need looking for affordable housing. So I think those are a couple of things we could be doing. But on your specific question, I also have heard, we've been talking with partners across the state. I have heard both of those issues around kind of the impact of short-term rentals and seasonal rentals, and also the impact of, aging Vermonters who are no longer have families living at home, living in these large large units that could house an entire family. And in part, I think looking at that latter question, I think what I've heard over and over is that, oftentimes it's we have a lack of access to senior housing in Vermont. And so there's really no place for people to be moving that they would need to be able to move into to kind of then sell their house and free up that house to be sold to a family who could use it as a family home. I think so that is definitely an issue. It's an issue I've heard about statewide from partners. So the need for more senior housing, I think, is really, really important as part of this trickle down impact of freeing up more units, particularly family size units, and also on the kind of impact on Airbnb and seasonal. Also, if you look at VHFA's housing needs assessment, they go through that in quite detail by locality, so you can really see what this looks like across the state. And so I think what you see from that is it is an issue, but is an issue that is more serious in communities that have tourist hubs like ski areas, like Ludlow, Vermont, or Stowe, or places like that, where it's a serious problem, less so in other communities where they don't have that kind of tourist hub nearby. But I do think it is important for the legislature to be looking at this, and municipalities. You had asked earlier what municipalities can do, for the legislature as a whole at the state level, and also localities to kind of think about ways that they could incentivize less use of those kind of short-term rentals and seasonal rentals, to free up those for permanent housing for folks in Vermont. Because in some of these areas, like Ludlow, for example, it's the percentage of people who are actually able to live there who are year round is shrinking at a pretty astronomical rate.
Thank you. Tom just sent in a question on the chat, and as a reminder, we still have some time. So if you have some burning questions for our experts, please put that in the chat. So have any Vermont communities used this Supreme Court decision as a way to take action against homeless people? So that really would probably be around what are some cities doing with their own encampment ordinances? Like, are more cities perhaps creating them, or like what does it look like? What is the landscape for municipalities in Vermont for having these kinds of ordinances that may directly relate back to this ruling? Maybe Falco, do you know?
I don't know of any municipalities that have specifically, tried to mirror exactly what was done in Grants Pass. And Frank, if you know of any, feel free to chime in. But I do know that there has been a lot of discussion at the municipal level trying to target what they see as quality of life offenses and concerns generally about the homeless population. And I think Brattleboro is an example of where we have seen some of those concerns rising up in terms of, the potential for criminal, criminal penalties related to disturbances of the peace that are often ones that might be associated with someone potentially being unhoused, or having some sort of substance use disorder or something along those lines. And then, also looking to promote use of municipal resources to fight things like panhandling. So I think they got the memo from the ACLU and others that you can't outright ban panhandling because it's protected First Amendment speech. But then they've turned around and said, well, if that's speech, we want to use speech of our own, try and put municipal resources behind discouraging folks from supporting panhandling and saying, if you give to a panhandler, you're supporting addiction, things like that, which I think are really problematic and stigmatizing. But I have heard that, there's been discussion around some of these types of ordinances where they can be put in place. But I don't know if any in particular that have really exactly mirrored what was done in Grants Pass. But Frank, you can jump in if you have anything that any knowledge that I don't on this.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. I think Brattleboro is the one place where we've seen that kind of not Grants Pass response, but that kind of larger criminalization response. So each region of Vermont has what's called a local housing coalition, which is really kind of a local coalition that brings together all of the various folks who are working in homelessness prevention work, kind of service side work. And so we meet regularly with those coalitions. And what I have heard has been, outside of Brattleboro, has been quite positive. I guess maybe not positive is the right word, but encouraging. We've heard lots of municipalities trying to figure out how they should respond to increasing number of unsheltered homeless in their communities. But in the same time, we've also seen municipalities really trying to think through this in a serious way and working with the local housing coalitions to figure out what effective solutions look like, and not just going to kind of knee-jerk reactions like we're just going to criminalize people from doing X, Y, or Z in certain parts of the community. So I have been encouraged from those conversations that we've seen multiple towns looking, asking about what does the evidence show, like what does real solutions look like, how can we ensure that we kind of have safe communities for all, including people who are unsheltered homeless in our communities. So I think that's been somewhat positive, but obviously it's early and we'll see what happens down the road.
Great. I have another question. So the rental assistance program that we had, over the last few years, I think probably a year and a half ago, the actual rental assistance piece ended for most people. But do you think that actually contributed to our current lack of affordable housing, because landlords were ensured that they were going to get their rent paid, and that they may have increased their rents, so that after that program ended, people were faced with a higher rent that they could afford and couldn't stay housed, but the demand is so high that the landlord could keep that high rate, and so that maybe it did a disservice by giving out that money for so long to landlords who could count on it and then raise their rents. Is there any truth to that, I guess?
I have not heard any truth to that, but I also have not seen evidence. I haven't seen evidence one way or the other on that. But I guess an equivalent or potential analogy would be the hotel motel program, and we heard similar issues. So previous to last legislative session, there was really no cap on how much hotels and motels could charge on a given night for folks in the program, and so you had some that were charging astronomical rates. That number was reined into a max cap of, I think, $80 a night during the last legislative session. And during the debate around that, there was lots of concern that if you do this, we can't do this because hotels are going to back out of the program. We heard hotel owners saying we're going to back out of the program if y'all do this. And then the caps passed, and roughly, there were very few hotels that backed out of the program after the caps passed. And so I don't know if it's not an apples to apples there, but it's a case of, we were allowing overcharging, we cut it off, and we didn't see a huge difference in outcome. And I know we still do have some cash assistance, just not at the level that we had before for folks in rental housing.
Did you have any comments on that, Falco?
No, I don't have anything specific that I can offer on that one.
That's okay. I mean, but what it really boils down to is that, like, as you're saying, we need more housing. There was this analogy that someone had used, with musical chairs, right? And if there's enough chairs for everybody, everyone gets a seat. When you take one chair away, the person with crutches doesn't get the seat, right? And it spirals so that you eventually have people who literally have no place to stay. And so if we build more affordable housing, the theory is that, rents will go down, or at least not continue to go up, because there will be less of a demand for the housing. I mean, I saw that, when I was younger, they had no problems finding apartments because there were plenty of apartments and they were cheap enough. And, literally 30 years later, it's a very, very different scenario for not just people who can't afford to live, but even people who can afford to pay for housing or rent. There's just not enough stock. So it looks like we don't have any other questions. Is there anyone who has a burning question that they would like to add? If not, I think, if each of you would like to just maybe say a few closing words to wrap up this great event, I think that would be appreciated by everyone.
Well, I'll jump in and just say I want to thank the League of Women Voters, Kellogg Hubbard Library, and Liz, our very capable moderator tonight. It's a really important discussion. I think it's one that's top of mind for so many folks right now, and it's impacting us in our communities. And it's one that if you care about, I do hope that you find ways to get involved on the state level as elected leaders come back to the State House in January, because I do think that is a place where we can generate more solutions. Municipalities can find more support, especially those who are struggling the most with some of the challenges. And so, hope folks will stay, if they're interested in some of this work, stay up to date with the work of HHAV and Frank and his crew and the work of the ACLU. We have a little bit more limited role in some of this work in terms of the real concerns about people's basic needs being met and the interactions with the criminal legal system. Others out there are definitely much more expert in terms of some of the solutions in terms of housing. But I just want to say I appreciate everyone who spent the time to be on this panel this night, listening to us and trying to learn more about this. And I hope you stay involved in the days and weeks ahead, because to put an optimistic spin in it, I think there are things that we can do. I think there are ways that we can work together to really improve the quality of life for everyone in the state and to better support all of our friends and neighbors and make our communities stronger.
I absolutely agree with everything Falco just said. And I think, just to give a little bit of context, I think about how much the impact that y'all could have if you reach out to your legislators and urge them to ensure that Vermonters are sheltered, that we are investing in affordable housing. Thinking back to where we were at the beginning of last legislative session, there was serious talk about completely ending the GA program, replacing it with just a couple of congregate shelters, which would have had catastrophically negative impacts for thousands of Vermonters across the state. And fast forward to the end of the session, and we're able to successfully push back on all those and really kind of increase the number of people based on where we started from who would be able to access GA. So I think it's really, and that happened because folks contacted their legislators and made their voices clear and talked about how this is not the Vermont that we want to see. So I think it's really important that folks reach out to your elected officials. They listen, they care, and if you push them hard, they will hopefully do the right thing here. If you want to learn more about how to get engaged in our work, you can go to our website at hhav.org and sign up for our lists. We have advocacy opportunities that we push out regularly throughout session, and we have background materials, fact sheets, etc., that you can get access to, and urge you to stay involved. And yeah, appreciate this discussion.
Great, thank you. And I just put in the chat for those of you who are civic minded and do want to put a word in. I put in a link which wasn't working so well this afternoon, but I tried it in Chrome. For making public comments about the budget process. And there's an opportunity to put your name and your town, and then whatever, part of the government that it relates to. There's probably a housing drop down to just make some comments there in that link. And that process, the public comment process, I think closes on the 13th. So you have just another day or two if you want to try to do that. Thank you to Frank and Falco. I really appreciate that. And Kate, I'm not sure if you or someone
I'm
else
here
is
now.
coming back. Okay.
Sure. Thank you, Liz. You've done a superb job. And I want to remind people that next month, January 8th, we will be addressing the Loper-Bright decision, which reversed the Chevron convention, I guess, and it, excuse me, it weakens the power of our regulatory agencies and refers such questions back to the courts, away from the experts and back to the courts to make some of these regulatory decisions. So that's January 8th. And thank you everyone for coming.